Bowdoin historian and author of a number of very interesting books on local history. And he's going to speak this afternoon about the history of the Bowden family who built La Rochelle and lived here in its early time. But before we start, I just want to say a couple of things. If you are interested in being a member of the museum, you get advance notice of special programs and invitations to members-only programs, free admission, and there are membership forms on the entry table. If you like our lecture series or the museum, or everything that we do or something that we do, please make a donation in the donation box at the back. And our upcoming programs, our annual meeting is next week, and the president of our board, Dick Koff, will be giving a lecture about the history of the postcards of Bar Harbor. And then finally, in October, and you can find the date up at the desk, I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but we have one more ramble for this season, and it is about the Ledgelawn Cemetery. It will be in the cemetery, and it will be led by our director, Aaron Koff. So please silence your cell phones if you haven't done that already, and join me in welcoming Max Smith.
All right, well, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you to the Bar Harbor Historical Society for this wonderful opportunity to research the Bowden family of Bar Harbor, their summer cottage La Rochelle, and their ties with legendary Bar Harbor summer colonist J.P. Morgan. The first chapter of the story of La Rochelle is the story of George and Julia's La Rochelle, by way of J.P. Morgan. The late 1800s and early 1900s, it was an era of concentrated wealth, of family background, and of society. George and Julia Bowden were symbols of their era. In 1903, the New York Times said George and Julia were, quote, representative of New York society as it was and as it is. George and Julia Bowden combined had a very enviable social pedigree. George Bowden was descended from James Bowden, who had founded Bowdoin College. Another ancestor was Alexander Hamilton, and another ancestor had served under General George Washington during the Revolutionary War. George Bowden would spend much of his childhood summers at the Hamilton Summer Cottage on the banks of the Hudson in New York. And this is where he spends time with Julia Grinnell. Julia Grinnell's family also has a summer cottage on the Hudson. Her family has made the fortune through shipping in New York City, where the Grinnell family is quite socially prominent. And one of Julia Grinnell's ancestors is Washington Irving, author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. At age 28, George marries Julia Grinnell, who's 24. They make a home in a 4-story townhouse on Park Avenue in New York City, and they raise their 3 children there. Soon George Bowden finds himself in the position as treasurer for J.P. Morgan, one of the most wealthiest and influential men of the era. Junius Pierpont Morgan's fortune was estimated to be worth $3 billion when adjusted for inflation. He was in charge of some of the country's most vital resources and industries, and his travels could affect the stock market. There was a headline in the New York Times in 1902, the year that construction began on La Rochelle, that read, J.P. Morgan returns and stocks advance, Wall Street affected by his being on American soil. And George Bowdoin is the man in charge of this vast treasure chest, and he holds the personal characteristics that one would expect for such an important position. He's very honest, he's very professional, he's very reliable, he's like clockwork. He's very modest, and this is a time that the wrong word from somebody in the J.P. Morgan organization can affect the economy of the world. And George handles this position very well. It becomes J.P. Morgan's go-to person. The Morgans and the Bowdens have similarities. J.P. Morgan is only 4 years older than George Bowdoin. The families socialized together quite a bit in New York City, often seen together at the Metropolitan Opera, which was the hub for society at the time. And George Bowdoin and J.P. Morgan are both founders of the Metropolitan Club, which is still in existence today, and which was seen as quite progressive because they had built a special room where women could entertain, quote, from time to time, unquote, and with the permission of the all-male Board of Governors. But again, quite progressive for the time. But what we find out is George's role as treasurer for J.P. Morgan becomes part of his identity. I'm not exaggerating when I say that whenever there's a news story about George Bowdoin or any member of his family, regardless of what the subject is, there's always a comma after George Bowdoin's name, and it says treasurer for J.P. Morgan. It's part of his identity. Now this takes us to the year 1903. George Bowdoin retires from J.P. Morgan at the age of 69. And this is the year that the Bowdens come to La Rochelle for the first time. The Bowdens, of course, choose Bar Harbor for their summer cottage to be built. And this is a natural choice because J.P. Morgan has already brought the attention of Bar Harbor to his board of directors, which represents some of the highest society in New York City. So many of the directors are here. The Bowdens are going to know many people here. It's a natural choice. But it should be noted for history's sake, even though J.P. Morgan drew many big names here, J.P. Morgan wouldn't have been here in the first place if it wasn't for his wife, Fanny. Frances Tracy Morgan was the daughter of one of the original rusticators here on the island at a time when you stayed in tents or in boarding homes or in a private home. And she loved the place so much that well into her marriage, she brings J.P. Morgan here. He loves the place, and he's credited with much of the summer colony of the time. But Fanny deserves the credit. The building of La Rochelle drew much attention here on the island. Bar Harbor's golden age was just getting underway, and there's cottages going up throughout the island at this point. But La Rochelle is only the second, I believe, brick mansion that's going up. Plus, the summer colony's thrilled to have the Bowdens here. They're associated with J.P. Morgan, they're solid people, they're not associated with scandal, and this is important in Bar Harbor's ongoing rivalry with Newport. The Bowdens commissioned noted architects Andrews, Jacques, and Rantoul of Boston, who had designed many cottages on the island at this point. And they commissioned noted landscape architect Beatrix Ferrand. And again, family connections are very important in Bar Harbor. They were at the time. Beatrix Ferrand's family were also Bar Harbor summer colonists. Her father was good friends with J.P. Morgan. They used to shoot rifles together. So when it came time for the landscape architecture to be commissioned, it was Beatrix Ferrand, who this was her 18th major garden to be designed and only the 7th garden here on Mount Desert Island. And the last little fact about the building of La Rochelle, at the time, that La Rochelle was completed in 1903, in the spring of that year, there was a labor strike on the island. So many cottages were going up that the local painters complained that quote-unquote non-union labor was being used to complete these projects. And the painters went on strike, and the carpenters went on strike in support. So I believe that the Bowdens and many prominent families came to Bar Harbor in 1903 to very prominent new mansions, and they weren't quite finished. Now, 1903, the arrival of the Bowdens finds George and Julia at a good point in their personal life. But they've had a few trials and tribulations to get here. Approximately a decade before this, I had mentioned they had 3 children. Approximately a decade before, their daughter Fanny had died unexpectedly at age 26, leaving behind a husband and a son. Fanny and her family had lived at 37 Park Avenue. George and Julia were at 39 Park Avenue, so they were right next door to each other. This is a close family. George and Julia's their son Temple, he and his wife have a daughter about a year after Fanny dies, but a few years after that, young Fanny and another child pass on, leaving Temple and his wife Helen with just one child. And then there's their 3rd child, Edith, who's 43 when the Bowdens first come to La Rochelle. She's unmarried, and by family tradition, she lives and travels with her parents. They arrive that summer. They're quickly part of the noted institutions of the golden age of the summer colony, the Bar Harbor Swim Club, which is still in existence as the Bar Harbor Club. They're generous supporters of the Mount Desert Island Hospital, the YMCA, several institutions like that. But the big story that comes out of their first summer is the fact that daughter Edith handles her own horses when she goes out in a horse and carriage. Says the story, Miss Bowden appeared in her Russian turnout for the first time Saturday noon. She was holding the reins herself over the 3 high-stepping grays and reined them around the corner in fine style. And it should be noted that whenever a society woman appeared in public handling her own horses, it did warrant a news story in the Bar Harbor Record. And then in a very telling personal note, the Bowdens go back to New York at the end of that first season. It's almost Christmas, and they're going to sail to Europe. And on the wharf, on the pier, there just to say goodbye to them and wish them a Merry Christmas is J.P. Morgan himself. Just a very personal gesture for a very busy man that didn't have to do something like that. The Morgans and the Bowdens were quite close. And this becomes the travel habit for the Bowdens. Summer here, winter in Europe and New York. When the Bowdens are in New York, they continue to socialize. But we find with the Bowdens, they don't socialize so much for the sake of socialization. They tend to be socializing for fundraisers for their charitable interests. They're very charitable people. Julia Grinnell Bowden is quite active in what's called, quote, the summer home for colored women and children, unquote, in New York. And here on Mount Desert Island, she's active in the Hampton Club, whose objective is to solve what they call the race problem. And what they do is they bring children from the African American and the Native American populations across the country to the island for the summer, where they're taught vocational and domestic skills. And what we see is for that 10 years of retirement, George Bowden gives away a small part of his fortune. He's very charitable, very supportive of Bowdoin College, and very supportive of scientific institutions in general. He had a very keen scientific mind. This brings us to 1911, This is the last good year in Bar Harbor for the Bowdens and the Morgans. The Bowdens have been coming here for 9 years now. This is the year that J.P. Morgan buys the area that becomes known as the estate Great Head by Sand Beach. He buys it for his daughter and son-in-law, but so he'll have a base of operations also. And Beatrix Ferrand is commissioned to design that garden. And on a side note, a few years after the estate is built, there's a silent movie film there, Queen of the Sea, which is a story unto itself. So it's their last good year for both families. The spring of 1912 arrives, and in the Atlantic, the Titanic sinks. J.P. Morgan is essentially the owner of Titanic, and all the anger and frustration of the public turns to J.P. Morgan after the sinking, and he quickly becomes a villain. Now, the summer season arrives in 1912. The Bowdens arrive, but they're only here for a month when they receive news that their daughter-in-law, Helen, wife of their son, Temple, has died unexpectedly in New York. So I assume they return there. A few weeks later, J.P. Morgan arrives, spends much of the time at the Bar Harbor Horse Show with his daughter. And then that following spring, almost a year to the day after Titanic sinks, J.P. Morgan dies. And in a very telling note, George Bowdoin is one of the pallbearers at his funeral. Brings us to 1913, the next year, the last summer together for George and Julia Bowdoin and daughter Edith. To put things into context, this is the first year that automobiles are allowed in Bar Harbor. And other than that, it's an ordinary summer for the Bowdens. They return to New York, but then a few days before Christmas, George Bowdoin dies in his home in New York City at the age of 80. He dies of pleurisy. His estate is estimated to be worth $500 million when adjusted for inflation. I think he was a very thrifty man. And his estate's divided between his son, daughter, and widow. But Julia and Edith inherit La Rochelle outright. They're a very traditional family. Even though they've lost George, Julia and Edith return for that summer season. But they're noted by the Bar Harbor Record and the New York Times to be in deep mourning. Which is ironic because this turns out to be one of the most exciting summers in Bar Harbor history, with the unexpected arrival of the Kronprinzessin Cecile. And just a very brief story is that Germany had suddenly declared war on Europe. This ship was sailing at the time loaded with passengers and gold. They needed to find the nearest safe harbor, so they arrived in Frenchman Bay at night. And the following morning, all the cottagers with their beautiful water view, knowing that Germany's just declared war, look out their windows and find a German ship, for some reason, anchored out there. And it turns out to be one of the most exciting summers in Bar Harbor history because it takes a while to get the crewmen back home. The Bowdens returned to New York at the end of that season. And then almost a year after George Bowdoin has passed away, George and Julia's son Temple dies unexpectedly of peritonitis. I believe he had an infection possibly after, looked like appendicitis. But he dies unexpectedly. He was 51. He had followed his father into the firm of J.P. Morgan, where he was serving as a director at the time of his death. And this leaves behind his son, George Temple, who's 16 and now an orphan. Now, attempts are made to place George Temple with family, but ultimately it appears that he's left as an independent adult, but one of his guardians is J.P. Morgan, Jr. 2 months after Temple dies unexpectedly, Julia Bowdoin passes away. The cause of death is heart disease, but I would argue it was a broken heart. It brings us to La Rochelle's second chapter. Edith is now the sole owner of La Rochelle. And for the first 2 years when she comes here, she comes that summer season after her mother dies. That first 2 years, you see some changes here at La Rochelle. At one time, the estate covered the other side of West Street extensively with support facilities. Edith had a gardener's cottage put over there to go with the greenhouses that were already there. She had a new garage built to accommodate her chauffeur, Leonard E. Lawson. And one of the big things she does, she donates substantially to Mount Desert Island Hospital in memory of her parents. But the biggest change we see in that first 2 years is Edith's length of stay here at La Rochelle. She starts having the mansion prepared by the end of May and doesn't leave until the 1st of October, much longer than her parents stayed. And now Edith has substantial resources. She can spend her time any place she wants. She chooses to extend her stay here in Bar Harbor. And I argue that this is a sign of her affection for Bar Harbor and her position here, and a reflection of probably the locals' respect and affection for Edith Bowdoin. Because Edith's becoming an institution and a symbol in Bar Harbor. By now, the golden age is just starting to wane, and Edith represents the golden age when it was at full luster. And we see her becoming an institution in a little small story from the Bar Harbor Record. They run a panoramic picture of the waterfront of Bar Harbor, taken from Bar Island, with a very small paragraph underneath. Quote, "The observer from Bar Island has an enchanting panorama spread before him. Looking along the shore, a handsome picture of summer homes may be witnessed, with all the delights of a seashore life in August. Noticeable among the cottages are La Rochelle, the home of Edith G. Bowdoin, daughter of the late George S. Bowdoin, for many years associated with J. Pierpont Morgan." So an example of that also. Edith is very active in World War I relief efforts, donating money and articles of clothing made by the household staff here at La Rochelle. In 1926, we note that La Rochelle has phone service. Their phone number is 350. She continues to donate championship cups to the horse show, the annual horse show. And she donates $500 to the Bar Harbor Police Department on the condition that they use that money to buy an automobile. And in the 20s, we see the arrival of Edith's nephew, George Temple Bowdoin, on Mount Desert Island. He arrives first on his yacht to visit, but eventually he and his wife and family establish a presence on the other side of the island. Edith is a very strong lover of animals, and she establishes the annual dog show of the Mount Desert Island Kennel Club, which is very professionally done under the auspices of the American Kennel Club. Edith Bowdoin is a founder of the Hancock County SPCA, which is still in existence, and she serves as its vice president for a while. What we see with the Bowdoins are a very practical family, and in the early 1900s, the SPCA created a program, the Horse Trough Program, where they're putting horse troughs beside roadways wherever there's fresh water. They put a pole next to the trough and they hang a pail from the pole, and a driver of horses can stop and water their horse in that trough. Edith takes responsibility for Alexander Hamilton Park in New York City. And here on Mount Desert Island, she has her staff from La Rochelle actually go out and build these horse troughs and the poles and everything. And I think we can see it from the sidewalk here. down at this crazy busy intersection by College of the Atlantic, there is supposedly still a horse trough there that Edith Bowden had built with a plaque that reads, "Erected by Edith G. Bowden, 1911. Now, one thing we see with Edith, where she breaks from tradition in society, at this point in time, women of society were supposed to get their names in the newspaper, but just on the society page, not on the news page. News page meant scandal, and you risked expulsion from the social register if your name was over there too much. Edith didn't care. Here, this is the headline from the New York Times from 1909. Miss Bowden causes a cruelty arrest. Miss Edith Bowden, 39 Park Avenue, while driving in her Victoria yesterday afternoon, saw a laundryman driving a lame horse. She stopped her carriage and sent her footman for a policeman. The laundryman was arrested. Miss Bowden driving to the police station and the footman making the complaint. The horse was sent to a livery and Miss Bowden drove home. She didn't care. She was going to protect the animals. So it takes us to 1922. There's going to be a rodeo at Madison Square Garden in New York City, which is quite a novelty, but the SPCA objects to a specific act in this rodeo, which is quite cruel to the cattle. So Edith writes a letter to the Bar Harbor Times expressing her opinion, and they run it. But this is where we see, 2 years later, we see Edith Bowden's influence and power that she's developed here in Bar Harbor over her decades here. In 1924, a biological facility was proposed to be built in Bar Harbor. And there were going to be numerous animal activities, but part of that was going to be testing on animals. And Edith Bowden was outraged that her second home of Bar Harbor would participate in animal testing. So she writes a letter to the editor of the Bar Harbor Times, who's a fellow board member on the SPCA and a fellow lover of animals. She writes, quote, she writes this to the editor, "As a trustee of the SPCA of Hancock County and a lover of animals, I trust that you will not sanction such an enterprise, but will give publicity to this plan in your valuable paper and try to reach those who are in ignorance of the proposition and give them a chance to voice their sentiments." Now this puts the editor of the Bar Harbor Times in a very difficult position. The newspaper does cater to the summer colony, but they're a year-round newspaper and they need to cater to the year-rounders too. Times are economically tough, and that biological facility is jobs at a time when jobs are needed. So the editor has to walk a very tight line. So what happens in that week from the time that Edith's letter is printed until the week later when the editor prints his reply, it appears that the editor went to the man in charge of building this biological facility. They had a discussion, and the editor was able to get the man to keep the rest of the facility but drop the animal testing component. And that's what the man did. Plans were announced, that modification was announced, and a week later the Bar Harbor Times writes, "In last Wednesday's Times we printed a letter from Miss Edith G. Bowden of New York and Bar Harbor, in which letter Miss Bowden protested against the establishment of the proposed facility in Bar Harbor. Miss Bowden's objection was an objection to the practice of vivisection, and she called upon us to assist in discouraging the facility for this reason. Miss Bowden's love for animals and her work on behalf of man's dumb friends through the agency of the SPCA is too well and favorably known to require comment from a Bar Harbor newspaper. Miss Bowden's expressed attitude on vivisection is perfectly consistent, and her point was well taken. We have the highest regard for Miss Bowden." So that's Emma Bowden. What happens, we go to 1943. By now, Edith has been coming here for 40 years now. The season of 1943, she doesn't make it because she passes away at her home in New York. She's age 74 at the time. I'm not sure of the cause, but it was natural causes. Edith's estate was valued at $26 million when adjusted for inflation. As expected, Edith made several generous charitable donations, including the YMCA here in Bar Harbor and the National SPCA. She leaves money to family, friends, and employees. And Edith Bowden has basically avoided the hint of scandal all her life. But it's her passing and the disposition of her prized chow dog, who's named Tuchin, where we get the first hint of scandal for her. Edith Bowden had a trust fund drawn up for Tuchin, worth roughly $250,000. And she leaves custody of Tuchin to two men, a doctor and a lawyer. She also leaves the doctor half of this $26 million estate. Now, very quickly, her two surviving nephews file suit against the will. Both men have ample resources of their own. It doesn't appear they're doing this for the money. Instead, they claim that these two men had undue influence over Edith in the last period of her life and had kept her separated from her family. The matter is settled out of court, and the details are not known. This brings us to chapter 3 and 4. These are brief, and they serve as my wind-up and my conclusion. Chapter 3 begins with the passing of Edith Bowden, and this is where we see La Rochelle start to transition from being the Bowdens' La Rochelle to becoming Bar Harbor's La Rochelle. The golden age has come to an end by this point. The Great Fire is only 4 years away. And the estate is bought by soon La Rochelle is setting deserted, like so many other mansions before it. A local man named Bernard Koff purchases the property. This is when the estate is split in two, divided by West Street. And just a description of what's on the other side of West Street gives you an idea of how immense this operation was back in the day. The support buildings over there, some of which still stand, included the caretaker's house, the chauffeur's house, a large garage, a carpenter shop with a lathe forge, a heating plant, a small stamp cutting building, 3 greenhouses, and the gardener's cottage. The Colquitt family of Philadelphia buys the mansion proper and owns it for about 27 years before donating it to the Maine Seacoast Mission. It serves as their headquarters for 47 years before La Rochelle was purchased in 2019 by the Bar Harbor Historical Society. In order to preserve the building and the grounds for future generations and to protect the history of Bar Harbor. Which brings us to chapter 4. In conclusion, I'm proud to say that we are all part of La Rochelle's 4th chapter. Exactly 120 years ago this year, the Bowdens came to La Rochelle for the first time as its first residents. The Bowden family, George, Julia, and Edith, all put their resources and efforts into their second home here in Bar Harbor for the betterment of their community here. That their home is now the home of the Bar Harbor Historical Society is beautifully fulfilling. The story of Bar Harbor, of its residents, and its summer colonists will never lose its relevance, and neither will the importance of La Rochelle in the telling of that story. With all the legacies left to Bar Harbor by the Bowdens, what more fitting legacy could there be than their home being used for the preservation of Bar Harbor's history, of which the Bowdens were such a part? La Rochelle is living history. So thank you, Bowden family, for allowing us this chance to write La Rochelle's 4th chapter together. That concludes my talk, and I'm going to turn it over and see if there's any questions. Thank you. Yes?
Hi, do you happen to have an estimate of like how many they had on staff here?
I don't know the number, but I believe it was a considerable staff that they had.
The New York census says that they had 9 servants, but they may have hired other ones when they came here, so. I don't know if she wanted me to say, but I also wanted to mention that we have a descendant of the Bowden family on Zoom with us today, Cynthia Kingsford, and she's descended from Fanny Bowden, the second daughter of the Bowdens who passed away in childbirth. So, welcome, Cindy. And Cindy, if you have any questions too, or anything you want to say, please unmute.
Well, I think it was great to hear everything from what you know. You filled in from the few stories I have from my family. My cousins and I were able to contact Carolyn and donate some Bowden items to the museum. So you may see them when you're there, and including some miniatures. There's one of Julia herself, and one of Fanny, and some shawls.
They're upstairs
So,
in the
my,
exhibition.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
That happened right now. So my grandfather was one of the cousins that was protesting Edith's will. One of the nephews that was protesting Edith's will. The story that was passed by the family was that Aunt Edith got under the clutches of the doctor and the lawyer, and maybe she had dementia. And she became increasingly obsessed with her dog, as you said, and basically then she left some items to her nephews and things like that, but she really didn't leave much of her estate. There are a few things. She had a household book that had all the contents of her house, and originally it says who's to get what, and then in the front it says, I cancel everything I've written in this book, no one's getting anything, and she signs it. So all the things that she was intending to go to different people, she reneged on or gave. I mean, no one really knows. So there was always sort of whoever the evil doctor and lawyer are, I don't know, it was all for the dog, and that's one of the stories that we heard. I do know that my grandfather, who was, his name was Irving Bowden, Kingsford, and his cousin George Temple did go to try and see what they could do to get some of the family items back that were part of the estate, because her whole estate was left to these people, and they had to buy back the portraits and the family items in order to have them remain in the family. That's the one thing I know. The other thing I know is that when my grandmother died, Fanny, George Bowden didn't trust, I guess, my great-grandfather because he was going to remarry, and so he came to the house and took back all of Fanny's family jewelry and brought him back to the Bowdens so that my great-grandfather wouldn't give him to his second wife. So that's the other story. So there's quirkiness in this family. They're benefactors, but there's also some odd quirkiness that would happen. And yes, in Temple, the son, like in many of the times, basically got most everything. The 2 daughters, I mean, Edith was part of the family, but Temple was the son, so he got it. So I guess that's how I can fill in whatever blanks there are, but thank you for letting me join you.
Thank you.
I know when I put this talk together, the story of Edith's will, it's a very interesting story, but I was afraid, and I hope that it's not taken as reflective of her entire life. It seemed to be just an unfortunate chapter. This family was so generous to Bar Harbor, and I appreciate the opportunity.
She may have had dementia, so I think like many older people, you can get, if you're alone and your parents have died, and you can get very much, so I think that might have been what happened. My father wrote a story about his great aunt Edith, and she sounded like quite a character, so yeah.
Nice, nice. Yes?
How did they come up with the name La Rochelle?
I believe that the name comes from the village that the original Bowden family came from in France. I hope that's correct.
That's right.
So it was probably Bowdoin. Their real name was probably Bowdoin.
I certainly wouldn't argue with that. I certainly wouldn't argue with that.
My last name is La Rochelle.
Okay. It's a
I'm
beautiful,
very curious.
it's a beautiful name for sure. So, yeah, that's what my research told me, but I think that might have been a bit of a guess. I'm not sure. But,
Are you a descendant of the doctor or the lawyer?
I will, the lawyer that was involved in what I just talked about, he was the cousin of Anne Morrow Lindbergh, who's, at the time, her husband had done the flight, but it was before the Lindbergh kidnapping. But just that association just gave a little tinge to the scandal. Very quick moving scandal, very small scandal, but it added, just a little fire to the headlines. Yes?
So I heard the connection of the Bowdoin family to Bowdoin College here. Is there a connection with Grinnell and Grinnell College in Iowa with the family as well?
Never encountered that in my research either way, so.
I'm not aware of that.
Okay.
I mean, I just know Moses Grinnell and the shipping in New Bedford.
Okay.
He was a ship's captain.
Okay.
That's my only knowledge of.
It doesn't seem like it would be a common name, and I may be wrong, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
We'll have to research that. Yeah.
Yes, my friend.
And the start with the Potter Palmers taking over and enlarging the guest house and servants' quarters across the street.
And I didn't hear the first part?
The Potter Palmers
Okay.
took over that
Okay.
from, I believe, the same time that the Colcuts had it, and they had been burned out in the fire of 1947, and
Okay.
so they greatly developed the estate across the way. Potter Palmers are from Chicago and founded the Art Institute there and whatnot.
One thing that didn't make it into my talk was the Colcuts. Mrs. Colcutt was quite active. There was an issue of zoning, and the big question seemed to be, after the fire, there's these large tracts of land that sure would fit a hotel, hotel, very nicely. Mrs. Colcutt wrote a letter to the Bar Harbor Times, basically opposing the change in zoning that would allow the large hotels in the spots where the cottages had been. I think she lost out, but yeah, she basically said, are we gonna keep the old summer colony or aren't we? And I don't know that the old summer colony was there to keep, but yeah. All right.
Back to Bowdoin College a little bit. So
Yes, sir.
George, I
Yes.
guess, was the son of the founder of Bowdoin College?
Not the son, I want to be grandson or great-grandson.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Did he?
No, it's actually, I don't have my history completely correct, but, R.J. Sullivan was George Sullivan's father, and he and his brother were R.J. Sullivan, and they changed their name to Bowdoin because their great uncle, or their uncle, was a Bowdoin and didn't have any descendants, and so for them to inherit the Bowdoin estate, they changed their name from Sullivan to Bowdoin, which was their mother's maiden name. So their mother's sister was a Bowdoin connection. Her brother had no children. The nephews took on Bowdoin as their surname and became Bowdoin. So it's diagonal.
Did they attend Bowdoin?
Did they attend Bowdoin College, do you think?
Not that I'm aware of, no. They didn't live in Maine, and I think at that time, Bowdoin wasn't as broad a collection of, I don't know, I went to Bowdoin, but.
All right, are there any other questions? If not, I just want to, before I say thank you for the last time, I want to make a little announcement. This seems to be the place to do it. Down East Books, the same good people associated with Down East Magazine, have just released information about my book 6, the title of which is Plain Madeline, Mrs. John Jacob Astor in Bar Harbor. So it's crammed full of Bar Harbor history. It's my Madeline Astor's biography, but I've tried to quantify the Astor family's presence on Mount Desert Island in this book also. That'll be out in March of next year. I hope folks might go to Sherman's and see if they might pre-order it if they're interested. And this seemed to be the best place to make that announcement. So, thank you again for everybody's time.